to be here, just because what you all are doing in practice, focusing on details, is a spiritual truth of our country.
You know, we can be Democrats and Republicans, but most Americans are patriots.
For over a decade now, good ideas have emanated from the BPC.
Thank you for convening this very impressive group of thought leaders.
Your organization has brought together leaders from across our society to advocate for common sense solutions to our most challenging problems.
Because if it's bipartisan, it's much more likely to pass.
When you have people philosophically and ideologically in two different worlds, and they put them together on a committee, that committee usually is not very productive. Once we get staffs blending, and John and I, they know that the members are friends and we talk, things can happen.
Thank you, Anand, for that introduction, and to the BPC for its important efforts.
Thank the Bipartisan Policy Center. You guys are great.
We all have bipartisan responsibilities to this nation to defend principles that have long made America the beacon of hope.
It's going to take all of us to try to turn down the temperature and really focus on what unites us.
Good afternoon. My name is Tom Romanoff. I lead the technology project at the Bipartisan Policy Center here in Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us today to discuss an important issue at today's event. Could the EU set U.S. artificial intelligence policy and standards? We have a great panel, and with me today is Elham Tabasi, the Chief of Staff for the Information Technology Laboratory at the U.S. National Institute of Standards and Technology. We have Marcus Andrew Young, Research Fellow and Head of Policy at the Center of Governance of AI. John Sharushin, the Senior Associate Director for Business and Technology. Sabine Neshka, Policy Analyst here at BPC. And I want to thank our panelists for joining us today for this important issue. And AI policy has sparked debates on both sides of the Atlantic, with important questions around the appropriate role of regulation and standards. Questions exist about whether policies set by the European Union can become the de facto global standards, or what's known as the Brussels effect, and to what extent. And today we'll look at those approaches to AI policy and how policies across the Atlantic could impact US systems here. Before we turn to our expert panel, Elham has agreed to a quick discussion, fireside chat, about her work at NIST and her efforts the efforts that her office has undertaken to establish a risk management framework. So thank you, Elham. And I'm just hoping, can you give me a brief overview of your work at NIST, which is the agency responsible for drafting the AI risk management framework, and what the agency is doing to push forward US AI initiatives?
Thank you, Thomas, and thank you, BPC, for having me here. It's a pleasure and delight to be here. About NIST, let me start by a very brief introduction of NIST for the people that may not know NIST. We are under Department of Commerce, a non-regulatory agency under Department of Commerce, and as the federal laboratory with the sole mission focus on driving US innovation and supporting economic security, NIST plays a central role in advancing critical and emerging technologies. We have a very broad portfolio of research, from AI to cybersecurity, advanced communications, quantum information sciences, bioengineering, and our scientists across all labs at NIST are using AI as a tool and doing the research that they're doing in the different disciplines. Within Information Technology Laboratory, where I am from, we have a program advancing trustworthy, responsible AI. Of course, AI is not new at NIST. I joined NIST in '99, and my first project was development of a open vocabulary speaker recognition. With the advances made in AI and the enormous potential that AI can have for changing our lives, but also a certain risk associated with AI. We have established this program of trustworthy, responsible AI to basically understand the limits and capabilities of AI, to understand the risks and trustworthiness characteristics of AI, to understand what constitutes trust and how we can make the technology rights-preserving, pro-innovation, pro-trade, and in a way that can help all sectors, all people maximize its benefits and minimize its risk. You mentioned the AI risk management framework. That's one of the major activities going on. That's a open, transparent, collaborative, consensus-based process to develop a framework for understanding, measuring, and managing the risks of AI. We also work with the whole community on advancing standards and evaluations for AI. And we also play some role on the policy domain, from administering the National AI Advisory Committee to other policies.
That's fantastic. So it sounds like you are working hard to build that consensus approach and in an open, transparent way. And that seems like it's challenging. So I'm curious, what are some of the greatest challenges you've seen in developing and putting together this risk management framework?
That's a great question, and there are a multitude and multi-dimensions of the challenge, but each of them also present an opportunity for us. But if I want to sum it all up, I would say that at least personally, the biggest challenge that I feel is the pressure to do it fast and to do it right. So we want a risk management framework that's technically solid, scientifically valid, while the whole discipline is moving and we don't have the stability in the discipline. By design, we want it to be law and regulation agnostic. We want it to be technology agnostic. So these are all the different constraints, and which is I think fine and good, and that's the scientific endeavor to overcome all of those things. But I think trying to do these things fast and do these things right, because the need for having AI risk management framework to have evaluation mechanisms and standard to have a trustworthy responsible AI is today, not 3 or 5 years from now.
That's an excellent point. So to follow up on that, it seems those outside pressures to do something fast, not necessarily just from industry, but also other governments that are approaching their governance of AI, which gets to a little bit of what we're going to be talking about today. And I'm just curious, has there been any kind of traction or tracking of how other governments are approaching AI that have been incorporated into your risk management framework, or any kind of lessons learned from how they were developed abroad?
Yeah, that's another excellent question. So when we started the AI risk management budget, which, as you may know, it's a congressional mandate, as we were working in this area, we received this congressional mandate as part of the AI Act of 2020. From the get-go, there wasn't any shortage of really good documents that articulate values that you want to see in AI systems, or principles of trustworthy, responsible AI. And add to that national strategy, add to that different agencies' documents on or frameworks. And from the very beginning, we made it a goal of the AIRMF to study all of them and try to come up with a unified approach to alignment with as many as documents, because we're in alignment with all of them is probably impractical. So we are intentionally trying to engage the whole community to understand what's going on and bring those knowledge, those informations, those input in the development of the AIRMF. In terms of the policy and regulations, and again, as you said, it's the topic of this discussion today. Prior to us starting working on the AIRMF, of course, EU AI Act was proposed, and we have been, I think, as I mentioned, we want the AI RMF to be a law policy agnostic, but also aligned with all of the other high-level principle documents. So we have been in discussions with every sector, every player in the field to develop some things that's flexible, structured, and kind of aligned with everything that's going on, but also stay pro-innovation and not becoming prescriptive. Anyway, in the AI RMF draft that you had seen, we have done a sort of a crosswalk from AI RMF to some high-level documents, for example, OECD AI recommendation or the Executive Order 13960 that lays out a principle for trustworthy AI for government use. But also the EU AI Act. And our goal is to make sure that, again, to the extent possible, these are aligned, because something bad for the whole community is to have a document that's divergent and not aligned with the other ones.
Well, it sounds like you're doing great work over there, and I'm just curious, you're developing these things out. I'm sure you've got a line into some of the other things that are happening at NIST around artificial intelligence, if there's any. And across the federal government, is there anything exciting that you have seen that is particularly interesting?
You know, not a day goes by that some exciting news, at least to us, doesn't happen from the industry, from the academia. So a lot of really exciting happenings, enthusiasm around AI and trustworthy AI. If I want to answer that from NIST perspective, I'm excited about a lot of things that's going on. Of course, AI RMF is something that we spend a lot of our time there, but I will mention a couple of other things that's going on. Our colleagues in physical measurement laboratory for the past 2 years has been focusing on understanding and building, we call them next generation chips that are dedicated for AI processing. You know, these are exotic hardware beyond CMOS. Think about spike neural net, neuromorphic hardware, specifically designed for AI and machine learning applications. So I'm really excited about that one, and I think that's part of the research that can allow for the next generation, next big leap in AI and machine learning.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for entertaining our couple of minutes where we get a chance to pick your brain a little bit. But I do want to turn it over to the panelists at this point and get some of their expertise on the table as well. So, you know, part of this panel was that BBC put together a report on how European Union and AI regulations over there would potentially impact the US. And it so happened at the same time that the Center for AI Governance also put out something very similar. So today we have the head of policy markets with us today. A couple of folks that are authors on our end with Sabine and John. So I'll start off with Sabine and kind of just talk through. I'd like to ask, you know, what are the reasons why you wrote this report, and what were your key takeaways?
Of course, thank you for the introductions and opportunity to introduce our report. It's titled Artificial Intelligence Policy and the European Union, authored by myself, John Sarushian, who's also here on this panel, and Jeremy Pesner. So our initial intentions were to find out what the EU is doing on AI policy. Europe's been such a driver of technology policies and regulations, especially in recent years with passing of GDPR and other such policies as Digital Services Act. So we thought it was important to gain a better understanding of Europe's approach to AI policy, and the timing couldn't have been better with the EU currently in the process of drafting a major law called the Artificial Intelligence Act that will specifically regulate the development and use of AI in the EU. So we decided to make this the main focus of our report. We spoke with stakeholders representing different viewpoints from civil society, academia, and industry to gather from them their perspectives on some of the major debates happening around the development of the AI Act. And so our report summarizes some of these debates. It shows areas of both disagreement, but then also some consensus on the issues. So for example, we saw disagreement about even the definition of AI and what constitutes an AI system. But interestingly, we did see some agreement on the use of, say, a risk-based approach. which sets different regulatory obligations based on the different risk that an AI poses. And I'm sure we'll get into more of the details of what's in the AI Act throughout this discussion, but the report we published is meant to inform policymakers and stakeholders on important policy developments, AI governance concepts, and as well as present challenges and opportunities of AI policymaking.
That's great. And I do want to, Marcus, you being from the Center of Governance of AI, you have your toe in the European waters, as they say, being based in the UK. So, you've written your own report on this topic, and same question to you. What were some of your key takeaways, and why did you write it?
Yeah, so we started working on this project it would have been sometime in 2020. So it was me working with it with a colleague called Charlotte Sigmund. The report is called the Brussels Effect in AI, and you should be able to just find it online. And yeah, we mainly got started so kind of inspired by, so us as an organization, the Center for the Governance of AI, generally what we're trying to do is we're trying to understand how AI will end up affecting society over the next couple of decades, trying to sort of make some forecasts or some predictions on that, and then based on that, sort of try to figure out what do we want society to do to prepare for those kinds of systems that we might have coming down the pike. And it seems like sort of understanding how that understanding how sort of the AI governance landscape will evolve, or sort of how regulation will evolve, seems like a particularly important question if you want to understand how AI will end up being used in the world. And so if that's the case, then it also seems particularly important to look at sort of the extent to which we'll have a Brussels effect, because that could be one way in which sort of one big determinant of what AI regulation looks like globally. It was also seemed important, partly because a lot of EU policymakers were talking about this idea of how they were inspired by, or so they were interested in trying to produce a Brussels effect with regards to AI. And then this was also in the period when Anu Bradford had just published a really, really good book called The Brussels Effect on generally sort of the EU's ability to affect, use this regulation to affect other jurisdictions. In terms of the main learnings, I mean, we'll get into it later on. I think generally our take is something like we're likely to see some kind of Brussels effect, both sort of de facto, i.e. sort of having companies comply with these requirements abroad or in other jurisdictions, and also to some extent de jure effect, i.e. having other jurisdictions produce similar kinds of regulations. We'll see to some extent, it doesn't seem to be, it won't be sort of to a full extent. I think in terms of other learnings, a really big one for me was getting a better handle on how these dynamics of regulatory diffusion work, and the ways in which jurisdictions can have impacts on other jurisdictions via their regulatory tools. And I guess for me, that's sort of changed my views in thinking that sort of these kinds of things will become a more important tool of sort of statecraft going forward, where if countries are trying to affect standards to have global impacts or sort of put themselves in a better position in sort of geopolitical, sort of technological competition, then I think the same thing might happen in this space of sort of AI regulation as well.
So I want to follow up on a question about that, but for folks that are listening in and watching, if you have any questions about any of the stuff we're talking about, please feel free to drop it into the chat. We'll try to get to them as soon as we can. We'll probably have some time at the end to go through them. If you're on Twitter, it's #BPC Live. YouTube, you just put it in the chat, and as well on Facebook, you can just put it in the chat. So Marcus, you mentioned, this idea that wanting to enact the Brussels effect, is that sort of a decision by regulators in EU to try to implement some changes, soft approach in the US?
So I find it difficult to tell. When EU policymakers talk about the AI Act and in general things in the sort of AI regulatory domain, they do make these claims about sort of a Brussels effect potentially being produced by the things that they're doing, and they use that as sort of motivation for the particular sort of regulatory agenda being important. But I don't know if it's actually a thing that shapes what the regulation ends up looking like, or if it's more sort of just a motivation to sort of make sure that it actually sort of sits on the policy agenda, or that sort of it seems particularly exciting or something like that.
Yeah. I guess this, I wonder if Elham has any reaction to kind of this idea that foreign governments moving forward, and potentially somebody listening to this might think we need to move forward as well. on some of these things, but you mentioned a very directed approach of taking your time, being agnostic, and trying to absorb it while continuing to progress on your own kind of governing AI of sorts.
Yeah, so the AI RMF completed version 1.0 will go out in January. That's the timeline that the Congress has been given us. And so I want to say that the work won't stop there. Of course, there's a lot that we can do, both in terms of developments of standards, evaluations, or effort to operationalize AI RMF. But January 2023 is just a few months away. And I don't see any sort of the way I look at it is not a race or a competition. I look at it as more of an ecosystem of trying to, at least from our side, to do the right thing, but do it in a sensible timeline. Yeah, so I guess we will engage the whole community, including the people involved at the policy level with the EU AI Act. And the more we do the discussions, and the more we can build the right standards that can be the backbone for all of this policies, I think that would be a good thing for the whole community.
Excellent. And I want to go over to John. We talked a little bit about what policymakers need to know. So why should policymakers care about AI, and what are the issues that they're trying to solve?
Yeah, so hi, Tom, thanks for having me. So the term AI was coined in the 1950s, and it's gone through multiple iterations what it exactly means. And actually, we still don't have a consensus definition of AI, as one of our panelists, I believe Sabine referenced earlier. But the recent iteration of what we're calling AI has really picked up due to sort of a great expansion in the amount of computing power and data we have. So a lot of modern AI techniques rely on the high level of compute and data that we have today. And this has caused AI systems to spread across society. And some people think it's just big tech. It's like that big tech is just the main driver of AI. No, it's far beyond big tech. Big tech companies obviously use AI, but so do healthcare companies, so do financial services companies, so do manufacturing companies, so do government agencies, civil society, you name it. AI has sort of expanded across different sectors, and we're testing new use cases and ways to sort of like apply AI or AI systems, in a variety of areas. So I think that's one reason that's important, is that AI, this current iteration has already expanded. There's a lot of opportunities and potential that we're already seeing, but there's also many challenges, and these challenges are important to get ahead of. So many of the challenges that come up are issues of harmful or unfair bias. Think someone who or an AI system that might be biased based on historical data, making an employment decision that could harm a group that was historically discriminated against, or people had unfair views of. There's privacy issues. So think facial recognition, image recognition technologies, different use cases for them, and sort of what privacy protections should be in place. That's another issue. There's also safety issues. Think autonomous vehicles. How do we deal with AI systems from a safety perspective? So those are all important issues that are coming up. There's many more that we could list, but high level, those are some of the important issues out there. And I think people are concerned about these issues and trying to find ways to address these issues. In order to build trust in AI systems and also minimize harm, I think it's important to address and think through these issues. And there's debates as to how to best address them. But I would say, in addition to trying to prevent harm or minimize harm or reduce harm, I think tapping a lot of the potential of AI and the upside of AI depends on addressing many of these issues. And I think policymakers, both in the US, EU, and in other countries, are focusing on what the best policy approach to AI is. And there's considerable debate, which we can get more into later, as to what the best way to address many of the challenges and harness many of the opportunities with AI.
Excellent. So a lot of what you just mentioned, I think Marcus might have a take on it from forecasting out some of these AI applications. So same question to you, Marcus. Why should policymakers care about AI, and what are they trying to solve for?
Yeah. Yes. I think all of the things that John said seem right and seem true. I think looking forward, I expect sort of AI systems to become much more capable, or sort of at least like much more able to have an impact on society. And so we might imagine that sort of AI might be a general purpose technology, maybe at sort of the same level of sort of impact on society as maybe electricity or maybe the internet. And if that's true, then we should expect sort of many more potential sort of regulatory issues to pop up over time. And so making sure that we sort of get ahead of the curve on this and sort of start understanding the ways in which AI systems might cause problems and sort of being able to regulate that seems particularly important to me. In terms of what regulators are actually trying to solve, I think one thing that's useful to point out is in the EU, the AI Act in particular is trying to sort of avoid acute harms to individuals. So sort of an individual's sort of human rights or their freedoms or something like this being sort of being compromised as a result of AI systems. And then I think going forward and also currently today, I think there's a bunch of other potential sort of challenges that AI systems might be posing that you might also require some kind of response from government. So in the EU, they're also putting in place this, they recently passed something called the Digital Services Act, which also will have some regulation of the kinds of recommender systems, for example, that social media platforms can use and some transparency on how they're using them. I think that's another example of another domain where we're likely to see sort of regulatory action more and more going forward.
For sure. And this we got a question from our YouTube broadcast, and it fits in nicely with the question that I have for Sabine. But the question from YouTube is, for those who do not have knowledge about the AI Act, what is some of the key issues, policy standards? And so Sabine, if you could just quickly explain what the EU is doing on AI and what the AI Act is for those that are listening.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So the AI Act is actually part of a larger EU strategy to enhance global leadership on AI and support development of ethical and trustworthy AI. Part of this larger strategy is including investments from Europe, 1 billion euros per year in the development and research of AI. But AI developments in Europe took off in 2019, especially when President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, set her intentions for presidency. She announced she would prioritize creating legislation to address the risks of AI. And this legislation is still being worked on today. It's moving through the legislative process, but as of now, it uses a risk-based approach. So it categorizes risks into 4 main categories, which I can touch on later and dive more into, but many of the components and details of this act are still up for debate. We're seeing continued progress from stakeholders and government officials who continue to provide feedback that are meant to improve upon the original draft.
And I think we should also define the Brussels effect. So, and whether or not we think this act that Sabine just explained will have that effect. So I posed that question to John and Marcus. So let's start with Marcus. Do you think that, well, first off, how do you define Brussels effect? And do you think this will have an impact, that a Brussels impact?
Yeah, so we talk about the Brussels effect just simply as regulation or sort of regulatory rules from Brussels having an effect beyond the EU's borders. So having effects in other jurisdictions. This could happen via a de facto route. So this is companies, they comply with the EU regulations, the EU rules, and then they roll out that same product in the rest of the world, or at least in some other jurisdictions. You can imagine cases where that's simply the cheaper way to go. So sort of historically, we've had this thing called the California effect, which sort of started this literature and a lot of thinking about sort of regulatory diffusion, where California puts in place sort of more stringent sort of environmental regulations for cars, for example, and then that means that you produce cars that are compliant with the Californian regulations, and then when you've done that, you might as well just sort of sell that car in the rest of the US and maybe in the rest of the world as well, because it's much more costly to just create two different production lines than just having one more streamlined one. And so we have similar effects in the AI case, and that might produce a Brussels effect. We also talk about the de jure Brussels effect, where other countries sort of produce or sort of adopt legislation or regulation that's similar to that of the EU as well.
John, do you have anything you want to add there?
In terms of Brussels effect, whether it occurs or not, I think it's going to depend on the use case and the risk factor. So Sabine, I think, mentioned 4. The one which I think there would be the highest likelihood of a Brussels effect, I think, is the high-risk category, but that's going to be very dependent on the use cases. So high-risk category, I think there's a more stringent regulation relative to the rest of the world. At least that's the sort of like feel that we have based on our interviews and sort of our own analysis. Europe's a huge market, so it's hard to imagine a lot of people trying to avoid the European market. In a lot of cases, devices you make for Europe, you're probably going to make the same device in the US or other countries. And that's, I think, the category where the Brussels effect's likely going to be the strongest. So one area where I think there will be probably a pretty significant Brussels effect is medical devices. You manufacture a medical device presumably for multiple jurisdictions, not just one. It's hard to sort of like tailor a production line, I would imagine, to make one for US, one for EU, one for somewhere else. So that's an area where I do think there will be a Brussels effect. In other categories or use cases, harder to tell, or I don't exactly see it. So in the lowest of risk, there's not much of a regulatory requirement or anything, so I don't think there will be much of a Brussels effect there. Then the unacceptable risk, where they outright ban products. If they're outright banning something, it means no one's going to make that product for the European Union. And that adds questions as to whether there will be much of a Brussels effect. If it's just outright banned in EU, if people are going to make it elsewhere, they're probably, going to make a decision on that. So I think it's still too soon to tell how much of a Brussels effect there will be, but I think it's heavily dependent on different use cases, and the high risk category would be the one that I'd be monitoring the closest for a Brussels effect.
But what would be an example of something other than medical devices being banned because of the harms there? Would a military application fit that mold?
Did you ask that would be banned?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Facial recognition software used by the police or law enforcement is potentially going to get banned. Marcus probably is closer to these topics, but yeah, that's one that stuck out to me.
Okay. Well, Marcus, I have a question for you then. We're talking about the Brussels effect. Why not the Beijing effect in that case, or Washington effect?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I think it's so one thing to note is when it comes to sort of a Washington effect, it actually used to be the case that sort of US regulation was more likely to diffuse globally than EU regulation. This shifted around the 90s to sort of swap places, and sort of the main thing that's happened since then is that the EU tends to sort of produce and pass significantly more stringent regulation than the US does when it comes to product safety, or when it comes to sort of domains where you're likely to see this kind of diffusion. And it's also the case that sort of regulation tends to be passed sooner than it is in the US. And so I think those are the main reasons that the US doesn't see a sort of a large Washington effect, at least when it comes to this de facto dynamic where a company sort of wants to comply with one jurisdiction, and then that sort of has effects on other jurisdictions as well because they offer the same product. If it were the case that the US would start to produce some of the world's most stringent regulation on some of these products where you might see these kinds of dynamics, I think it's quite likely that we would see more Washington effects. And then on the jure side, I do think that we see sort of Washington effects already, but yeah, less so than you might expect, just given sort of the US's global influence, simply because the US doesn't tend to sort of pass the most stringent regulation. If you're not passing more stringent regulation than another jurisdiction on some kind of dimension, then there's no way in which you could change what regulation they might have. And when it comes to the Beijing effect, I think that is also a really, really interesting question. Overall, I think sort of a de facto effect is a bit less likely in that domain because a lot of companies tend to offer different products on the Chinese market and in other jurisdictions, simply because the regulatory environment is so different. However, we might see this kind of de facto effect happen as a result of Chinese companies producing Chinese compliant products and offering those products globally. And then when it comes to the jury effect, historically in Beijing or in China, a lot of sort of safety regulation has been very inspired by the EU. And then I think we might start seeing this kind of changing over time as sort of the regulatory capacity in Beijing is sort of going up. And so, for example, in the AI space, we've recently seen China pass regulation on recommender systems, for example, that sort of before the EU has done so. And so maybe in the future we're going to see more of a Beijing effect in this domain. And maybe there's some case to be made that we could see a de facto or sort of a Beijing effect when it comes to sort of maybe the Chinese government managing to export certain approaches to how to do surveillance and whatnot as well.
So a lot of what we've been talking about is the risk approach, and there's a lot of benefits to using AI, but in terms of the AI Act, it uses a risk-based approach to create these standards and legal requirements for riskier AI systems. And I want to ask Sabine, how will risk be measured in that case, and how will you determine whether the use of AI falls under that risk?
Yeah, so let me first walk through how the AI Act categorizes risks. So we've already touched on the unacceptable risks and the high risks, but there's also limited and lower minimal risk AI. The AI Act has annexes to list what falls under high or unacceptable risks, and those systems will have to comply with conformity assessments and other such rules. Unacceptable risks are outright banned from the EU. Meanwhile, lower risk systems will be subject to limited transparency obligations or very few obligations at all. As for how to classify these AI systems into the categories, there's a few things to consider. I mean, generally systems that make riskier decisions should require higher constraints. So for example, if you have an AI system making a healthcare diagnostic decision, it should probably face higher scrutiny than an AI system serving me ads on a social media feed. But these AI systems can cut across different applications and have varying risk levels depending on their use. So that AI system used in advertising may seem harmless in comparison, but the same system that collects my information could also be collecting the information of a child. And that would all of a sudden put it in this sort of high risk area, depending how it's defined in the end. So categorizing the risk can be difficult, and how to do so or what systems are considered under this annex is still highly debated among stakeholders and policymakers.
Something that I'm sure Elham is very familiar with in terms of the risk management framework. And I just actually want to kick it over to John. Elham introduced what NIST is doing in AI policy, but can you explain some maybe nuances and differences between how the EU Act differs from the US approach of AI governance?
Yeah, sure. So one thing to sort of set the stage I think is important to do is that the US and EU overall have a lot of differences that go beyond just AI policy. So there's different governance structures in the US versus EU. US is obviously just one country, while the EU is many countries. US legal system has evolved in different ways, our tort system is different. So I think that context is important to just think when thinking about AI policy, there's other differences between the countries that may result in different policy approaches to AI. So I just want to put that out there at the upfront just to give people a little bit of context. That said, when I think about laws in the US when it comes to AI policy, I think right now one of the biggest things people are focused on are on frameworks and standards, with the risk management framework at NIST, which Elham so eloquently talked about, being one of the areas that is getting a lot of attention. So standards and frameworks, I think, are a big focus in the US, and then a lot of focus on building on existing laws and sort of our existing tort system for maybe specific sectors or in specific use cases. Think financial regulatory agencies and how AI is used in the financial sector. So the US, again, overall, I think is focused more on standards frameworks with building on existing laws and regulations as a second component. European Union right now is focusing on putting in place new legislation and regulation, with the EU AI Act being sort of the big example of this right now. Philosophically, because we've been talking to different stakeholders who are on different sides of these issues and debating each other, there's this idea of a precautionary versus permissive approach to regulation and AI policy, or precautionary principle versus permissionless innovation, to use sort of a term we heard quite a bit with the people on the precautionary side, focused a lot on trying to prevent harm before it occurs, while the people on the more permissive side concerned about overregulation, stifling innovation. And that's one where no one's really 100% one camp or the other, but there's some tensions as to how close we should move to the permissive versus precautionary side of things, with the European Union being on the more precautionary end of things. So that's another big area of debate between the US and EU. That said, the US and EU are often cooperating with each other in many regards. So that's something to sort of be mindful of. And, they both should at least try to learn from each other, see what works, what doesn't work with each other's approach. And it's still early days when it comes to AI policy. It's interesting to see how the debates evolve in both countries, and sort of which direction, each will go, and sort of how they will sort of play into each other's ecosystem. So yeah.
So a quick follow-up question from that, because we are taking questions from the audience, and this is coming in from Jake Easter, and I pose it to the panel, but also John, if you want to take it, because you touched upon it a little bit, is how do we balance the tension in governance of not stifling innovation inadvertently and incentivizing business to lead the U.S. with effective essential risk management? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So one, I think focusing on the different risk factors and impacts different use cases and technologies have is important. So if something is very risky, we probably want to lean and be more let's prevent harm. And if something is a bit less risky, again, I like to think of a chess system that uses AI is probably not the riskiest of applications of AI, especially if it's artificial narrow intelligence. So that might be one where we try to focus less on what regulation legislation, because again, if the risks aren't that high for AI chess system, we should maybe be a bit more encouraging of experimentation and innovation. So that's one general comment. Another comment is oftentimes we hear this debate between what some refer to as hard law versus soft law. Hard law being legislation, regulation, and soft law being more standards, frameworks. Where hard law approaches tend to have more enforcement power behind them, but they're often slower to react. The regulatory process can often be slower, while soft law approaches tend to be much more flexible and nimble, but they have less enforcement power behind them usually. So that's another area where I think it's important to consider. Balancing the two is going to be, pretty big issue going forward, and there's going to be philosophical differences between people, but there's also this element of learning as we go. We're going to do more research, more studies as a country, and European Union is going to do the same. And I think we're going to learn a lot more things, and I think it's important for policymakers to sort of keep an open mind and try to understand the different perspectives on these issues.
Yeah, I think another important factor is sometimes it's easy to have this view that sort of regulatory action and innovation are just sort of diametrically opposed. I think there are some cases where we should expect that not to be the case. So, for example, if you're following this U.S. approach, where sort of the standard way in which things will happen is that you let your regulators do their jobs. You let them figure out how is my domain, how is my industry, the kinds of harms that I'm looking at for, how are they going to be affected by AI, and then figuring out how to adapt the current rules to the context of AI. One problem that might appear in that case is that you might end up with a lot of sort of regulatory divergence. You get divergence in what kinds of rules you have to comply with in different industries. And then that might then sort of stifle innovation if it's the case that some of the most sort of impressive or some of the most useful AI systems are those that can be used across a number of different industries. So, for example, a lot of recent progress in AI is in sort of large language models, models that can sort of produce sort of coherent human-like text in response to certain prompts or certain questions, for example. Those are models that could be used across the entire economy and are being used in a lot of different contexts. And so it might be the case that you want to make sure that there are sort of standard ways in which these sort of systems are regulated, or in the kinds of rules that they need to follow, or whatever it might be across the entire economy.
Great. And I do want to mention that we do have a question from the audience about black box. We'll get to that in a moment. I just want to close out some of the risk conversation we had. And then we'll get to as many questions as we can. If you have any for folks that are still on the line, hashtag BBC Live, we'd love to get to them as soon as we can. But I guess following up with this idea of trade-offs that we have with the AI systems and the risk-based approach and stifling innovation versus government regulation. And John, I'm curious, do you have any other trade-offs that you think policymakers should be aware of or think about while they're looking at this?
Yeah, so I think sort of building off what Marcus said, sometimes there are trade-offs and sometimes there are not trade-offs. So sometimes addressing harm can be pro-innovation because it builds trust and, just basic trust in the technology, which allows more people to use it and people to sort of create more products and services. So I think that's an important point to make. So one time it's not necessarily like what are the different trade-offs, it's when does a trade-off exist and when is it actually kind of a win-win situation. With trade-offs, so often I think about sort of a flexible approach that has less enforcement power versus one that is with more enforcement backing, but a bit slower. This is kind of the hard law, soft law dynamic I mentioned. And while I said sometimes the sort of like approach for addressing harm actually benefits innovation, there are times when over-regulation can stifle innovation. So those are times where there is a trade-off of sorts. And again, we still don't fully understand the extent of the trade-offs and when they apply. I think we're building more learning on it, and we have at least some sense of it. And another thing to keep in mind is, as I mentioned earlier, AI has gone through multiple iterations, and we don't know exactly where the technology is going to be in 10, 20 years. We don't know the different use cases. So one thing to keep in mind is also the level of uncertainty long term. So if you're designing policy today, how well is it going to match up with where the technology is 20 years from now?
No. Marcus, you look like you wanted to add to that.
Oh, no, definitely agree. That sounds right. And I think makes the challenge very, very difficult. I think, for example, I think it means that you need to figure out ways to sort of build in more flexibility in your systems. Like, for example, if you're the EU, for example, then things that you might want to do include, as you have sort of your requirements that you place, for example, in high-risk systems, as they are sort of operationalized via standard-setting bodies, then maybe in the AI case, compared to other technologies or other domains of regulation, maybe you need to make sure that these standards can be updated more quickly, and you have sort of better ways of making sure to check whether these standards are still sort of being kept up to date with sort of how the technology is evolving, and then you could imagine that sort of the US will likely need to do similar things, and I imagine that NIST will be a huge leader in making sure that the US will be able to keep pace.
Absolutely. So last question before we turn it over to audience questions, and that is, we've talked a lot about different trade-offs and kind of big picture government regulation versus innovation. I want to ask each of the panelists, why should policymakers be paying attention to this particular EU regulation and what they're doing on AI, and what can they learn from what the folks over in Europe are doing, and how might that be playing a role with what they do here in the United States? Sabine?
Yeah, so I definitely encourage policymakers to pay attention to and learn from the EU's AI Act. But I also want to emphasize some of the coordinated efforts by the US and EU to address AI challenges, and why that might be valuable as well. So both the US and the EU have signaled they're making commitments to ensuring responsible use of AI systems and at the same time encouraging the development and innovation of the technology. We've seen at transatlantic talks over the years that there are many shared values between the US and EU when it comes to AI. So because of these common goals, such as fairness, accountability, transparency, I think both the US and European policymakers will find value in learning from each other's individual efforts. They should be aware of each other's developments to help foster reciprocal behaviors and promote positive AI governance practices.
Marcus, anything to add?
Yeah, I think one thing to keep in mind is something like US policymakers, they will likely see their sort of degrees of freedom in terms of sort of what kinds of policy to put in place or what kinds of sort of regulation to pass and that kind of thing, to some extent be a little bit constrained by what the EU does, in the sense of sort of, if it's the case of what the EU does produces these de facto effects, it affects sort of US companies and what kinds of products are offered on the US market in certain sectors. In that case, it would be more costly than it would have been otherwise to sort of diverge from the EU approach. And so I think that's just a thing that you're going to have to pay attention to and be aware of as a policymaker. I think importantly, when it comes to that, I think you need to remember that it's more important to ensure that there's sort of convergence or similarities with regards to the kinds of requirements that are being fulfilled or that are sort of being imposed on the kinds of systems that that companies can put onto the market, rather than sort of the exact way in which the EU sort of carves up the risk landscape and sort of what kinds of systems that they would call high risk. The sort of additional cost that you impose here would mainly be in the case where there's one company who has one product they want to offer in the EU and in the US, and if that product is sort of sees different requirements in these different jurisdictions, that might sort of cause some kind of problems. I think another thing to potentially look out for is that I think it seems likely that US on the state level, we're more likely to start seeing AI regulation before we are on the federal level. And my guess is that that's going to be a development that's going to be important to look out for, and that might in the end be sort of set the stage for whether at some point in the future there is sort of federal regulation on maybe some part of the AI industry. And I think that will that causal connection there is going to be important as well.
Good, thank you. John, anything to add?
Yeah, I'll probably repeat some of what the panelists said, maybe give my own sort of like spin to it. One, I think policymakers should definitely pay attention to what's going on with Europe on AI policy, and specifically the European AI Act. Three things that usually come to my mind as to why. One is rules and regulations in the European Union often can have direct effects on the US in the form of a Brussels effect. So that's one thing I always think about when thinking about why policymakers should pay attention to Europe. Second thing is there's often a lot of coordination, cooperation, and knowing what, the other side of the Atlantic, what's happening on the other side of the Atlantic is important to make sure coordination, cooperation happens and happens well. And then the third thing that I usually say is there's a lot that we can both learn in terms of what to do, what not to do, and what can be improved by looking at other countries and other regions. So those are the three main reasons I strongly encourage policymakers to take a look at what is happening in the European Union. And I, again, just put a plug in for our report. Please check out our report on artificial intelligence on the European Union on the Bipartisan Policy website. Thank you.
And Elham, I know, it's kind of, you are a policymaker. So is there anything, I want to make sure that you have the last word, or is there anything that you heard here that you thought was, you were particularly interesting, but I yield the floor for the last word of the conversation before we go over to audience questions.
Appreciate that. A lot of really good points has been made, and I'm taking notes of that. So grateful for the discussions. I think it's important for the policymakers, one of your earlier questions, to pay attention to AI because of its enormous impact on human lives and how it can exacerbate or perpetuate some of the inequalities, but also because of the enormous potential that it can have for improving our lives. Completely agree with everything that said, that both sides of Atlantic can learn from each other. And I think in terms of the last word, I would say that there is a lot of interest from both sides to do technically sound, scientifically valid, rights affirming and rights preserving way of operationalizing values that the common values that the both sides of the Atlantic believe in. So I take that as a good starting point, and as it was mentioned, more discussions, more learning from each other would make it better for the whole community of AI developers and users and the whole society. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. So I'm turning it over to the audience questions, and I'll just read them as I got them. And it's open to anybody on the panel to answer. But first question is, I'm a Tanzanian lawyer practicing in the tech space. One of the biggest challenges of AI is the black box phenomenon. As policymakers, what is your take on this aspect when it comes to regulation?
So I can jump in. So I'm not a policymaker, so I assume it meant just as people who study the issue. Yeah, one of the areas that we sort of looked into throughout our work on AI is the role of research and development when it comes to addressing many of the challenges in AI. So the black box issue comes up a lot. And I think this is an area of like considerable academic and research interest. And I think R&D is one of the areas where trying to find ways to sort of like open up the black box and figure out what's inside of it is one of the things I think that's important. And I think both government and private sector should play a role in that space.
Yeah, I think that sounds super. Yeah, it's very, very important work to try to make sure that our systems are sort of more interpretable. I think another thing that's important to keep in mind is that sort of depending on your regulatory goal, the sort of interpretability of the system might differ, or sort of the extent to which you actually need it might differ. And so in certain cases, the thing that truly just matters is whether it actually works in the context. And so, for example, if you have a factory robot, for example, then it might be enough to simply have sort of tested it a tremendous amount and seen that it actually does what it's supposed to do, and you don't need to know the exact details of why it does what it does. Perhaps you need that for liability reasons, but I think it's maybe a little bit less clear. So I think that's sort of an important thing to keep in mind. So I mean, another way to sort of put that point is a lot of decisions in our economy is made by humans. Our brains are to some extent black boxes. It's kind of difficult to sort of extract and figure out why we're actually making the decisions we're making.
Great point. Is there anybody else who wants to address that question?
I will just add that the AI risk management framework that we are developing with a lot of emphasis on transparency and documentation. Explainability and interpretability is one of the trustworthy characteristics identified in the draft. So that become part of how making AI systems trustworthy. But beyond interpretable model, emphasis on documentations for the purpose of the transparency is an important goal on achieving trustworthy responsible AI.
And that kind of gets into another question we had from the audience from Michelle Goetz. Apologies if I said your name incorrectly. Can you further unpack how model is used in one category and then reused in another? How do you see oversight regs and frameworks evolve to handle that?
So I assume the thought is in a context where there's one system, that system is used for different high risk cases, perhaps, or maybe it's if it's used in categories that have different requirements. Does that seem like it's the question?
I think the question goes towards, if you're identifying a high risk area category, how does that transition, say, from financial sector to health sector?
Yeah, I think one point that is going to be really important, especially as the US sort of develops its regulatory system with regards to AI more, is that you might just need very different requirements, or different kinds of requirements might need different weight in different contexts. And so what Sabina was pointing out earlier, for example, is sort of a system that sort of makes a lot of small decisions that might sort of in aggregate matter. That system might need quite different requirements from a system that makes sort of maybe a smaller number of decisions, each of which is very important that it goes right. You might imagine that sort of in the latter case, you might need to make sure, or sort of in the former case, you might need to make sure that you sort of do post-market monitoring, for example, and you can sort of detect the error over time and adjust. Whereas in the other case, then you really need to make sure that every single time it works out well, and you're able to maybe reverse the decision, for example.
Great. And with that, I think we're going to be closing out. That's all the questions that we have today. I want to thank everybody who joined us today. Please be sure to check out the recording. We'll also provide a synopsis of this on our website, bpc.gov. Oh, sorry, .org. Sorry, my gov days still linger somewhere in the mind. Please make sure to email us if you have any questions. This information will all be available on our website. So also check out our report, and also check out Marcus's report as well. We can link to that as well on our website. But thank you for joining us, and thank you, panelists, for speaking today. I very much appreciate your time, and it's been a pleasure to speak with you tonight.
Thank you so much
for having us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.